recording, so we're going to give you a countdown. It's 30 minutes. That's fine. Countdown's fine. Yeah. It's 30 minutes. At minute 25, you come in here and give them a 5-minute warning. Yeah. You know, you come in here between the cameras so we can see you. Put up to 5. Yeah. After that, you want to give them the 2-minute warning. Start to really wrap it up. Then after that, if you want to come in here at 30 seconds, just give them the. We gotta go 30 seconds. Okay. And then once you go back into the control room and start pressing record. Yeah. All right. So we're gonna give it a countdown, and which is good. We can do it right now. Okay. From in there.
Okay.
Yeah, you can hear us.
Welcome to the first segment of a new program, we hope. It's called Voices of Veterans. My name is David Yano, and I live in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm here with Steve Fournier, who is also a fellow veteran, a former Air Force veteran. We are both, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and Steve was in Germany during the Vietnam War. So we have a lot of things that we can talk to you about. But what I want to first bring to your attention is what we're going to be doing as a veterans program. The reason it's called Voices of Veterans is that we intend, as we do more programming, to have veterans come on as guests and to be with us here to also talk about their issues and their time as a veteran in the United States military. We're also here to bring you information that's valuable to veterans and their families about what they can access with the Veterans Association and where they can go for help if such is needed. There is, in Hartford at this time, a newly established Hartford Veterans Commission, of which I am a commissioner and a member. We meet once a month, every month, and bring up issues. Most of us have been advocates for veterans for a very long time, so we hope to continue to do that and to be advocates for the veterans, and have some of those commissioners also will be invited on as guests in the program. The other thing that I'm here to bring to you about is to talk about the Veterans Center at the Hartford Veterans Center, which was on Market Street in Hartford at one time, and we moved out to Wethersfield, and now is currently located in Rocky Hill. The Vet Center mission is to serve veterans and their families by providing a continuum of quality care that adds for the veterans, families, and their communities. Care includes professional readjustment counseling, community education, outreach to special populations, and brokering of services with community agencies, and provide key access link between veterans and other services in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. That is going to be one of the key things that we're going to be working on. Also, we hope to bring you the voices of veterans in a number of other ways besides guest speakers. We also are going to bring you books, poetry, and readings of veterans that have participated in all of the wars that were going on right now, Iraq and Afghanistan, and also a fair amount of Vietnam veterans. One of the things that Hartford's been struggling with is budget problems that we're having in the city of Hartford, some of which can be directly attributed to the amount of resources we've put into all of the wars that have been going on and are continuing to go on today. For the city of Hartford itself, since 2001, it has cost the city of Hartford $444.5 million. And the state of Connecticut, it has cost the state of Connecticut $29.8 billion. These are money figures that should resonate with us, especially in these days of budgetary concerns and cutbacks that we're all being forced to look at. I think it's important for the American public to know what has been happening with our money overseas and all of the arms that we have created. We have a tremendous defense industry in Connecticut, and it seems to me that a lot of those defense industries are supported by the federal tax dollar to the detriment of teachers, librarians, social workers, and public works people who keep the state alive and running. So these are also issues that we hope to bring to everyone's attention. One of the most costliest things of the war has been the damage that it has been done to veterans themselves. We hope also to talk about the ongoing effects of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress syndrome. We also want to talk about all of the injuries that have occurred to veterans that have lost limbs, have lost body parts, and are now using prosthetics to return to their families. We also want to talk about opioid addiction and drug addiction, which has seemed to been epidemic within the veteran population. One of the things that these various things have led to is a high suicide rate among veterans. In fact, there are as many as 300 veterans a day committing suicide at one point during the height of the war. So all of these statistics add up to the cost of the war in the loss of families, the loss of jobs, and everything else. So we have to bring this to your attention, and that's why we're doing this program. One of the issues also that occurred in the wars that we've had have been the poisons that people have been subjected to, specifically Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam. Dioxin, which is a chemical herbicide, was sprayed all over the country of Vietnam and dropped all over veterans who were there. It's bad enough that the veterans became so affected by it that they came home with cancers, diabetes, and various other attributed diseases, Parkinson's disease and others, to exposure to Agent Orange. However, we don't often think about what the damage that was done to the Vietnamese people themselves and their land and their children, because they're suffering from a high degree of birth defects. So we want to, at some point in our time, bring up all of these issues at some point and discuss them and read and take literature and read about them. One of the things that we do in the Hartford Veteran Center is we have PTSD group meetings in which veterans sit together and talk amongst themselves. They're basically rap groups. And these rap groups were the beginning of the VA centers, the veteran centers that are all over the country right now. And the birth of these rap groups started in New York City amongst a group of Vietnam veterans who decided one day that they needed to sit down and talk to each other about their experiences of the war in Vietnam. And that has thankfully spread all over the country to the point now where the Veterans Administration now recognizes the veteran centers as being very apropos and helpful in getting veterans readjusted. We also have now a lot of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who are also working in their groups on some of the same issues that have hurt their fellow soldiers. One of the things I'm going to talk about is my personal journey into how I got to this position of coming on television and actually talking about some of the things that happened to me. So I'm going to give you a little personal history of myself at this point. I am what's known as an Army brat. I spent 16 years growing up within the military. My father was a career officer in the United States Army and a physician. And as a family, I had four brothers and a sister. There were four of us, 4 boys and a girl, or a family of 5. And my mother, we would receive orders every 2 to 3 years, and we would be moved from one military base to another military base. In the tradition of ancient camp followers who used to follow behind the armies that were fighting all across Europe, we're very similar to that. We lived on military bases, which are a completely enclosed society. We lived all over the United States, including 5 years spent overseas in Asia. I've lived in Okinawa, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. And this experience, while it was slightly traumatic at times, was also quite an adventure when you're a young kid. So we got to see different parts of the world, we got to see different parts of the United States. But what I really feel it did was it prepared me in a lot of ways as a sense of conditioning to look at the military as something that I thought that I wanted to participate in. So all throughout the 60s, when we were stationed back here in the United States, we watched the war in Vietnam grow. And in some respects, that war had already started before I was even born, because our first activities in Vietnam were in 1945 when the Roosevelt and Truman administration were supporting Ho Chi Minh and his followers to help fight the Japanese. So today when they call the war in Afghanistan America's longest war, that's really an error, because the war in Vietnam started in 1945 and ran all the way up until the collapse of Saigon and the fall in April 30th of 1975. So as I was going through high school, I was watching this war on television. It was the first televised war that Americans could watch on a regular basis. And every year, as we moved along from Fort Lewis, we moved from Texas, Fort Sam Houston, we moved up to Denver, Colorado, and Aurora. We moved to Fort Lewis in Washington State. And every year, as I got closer to graduation from high school, I could see that this war was going to be part of my life. In 1969, on graduation from high school, I told my father, then a colonel in the United States Army, that I was going to enlist in the United States Army and volunteer for Vietnam. My father told me that, David, this is a bad war. What a good war was, no one could really explain. But I think he was trying to give me some advice that as an 18-year-old, I really wasn't ready to listen to. I was an honor student and an athlete. I already had been accepted to the University of Washington. I could have taken a college deferment and gone to the University of Washington and skipped the war. But I told my father that if I did that, someone else would have to take my place because the draft was going on at that time. So I enlisted in the United States Army. I was what they call RA all the way, a regular Army. I enlisted and I volunteered for Vietnam. Because I enlisted for a 3-year period, I was allowed to choose the school that I wanted to go to, which gave you your MOS, your Military Occupational Specialty. I chose to be a medic, and I went to Fort Sam Houston, where I was trained as a medic. My wife, who I had met at Fort Lewis, Washington, was also an Army brat. Her father was a career soldier and a non-commissioned officer. He fought up the island chain with MacArthur, was a member of the occupation army in Japan, and married a Japanese woman, a Japanese war bride. So my wife was born in Japan, the daughter of an American serviceman, which means she was automatically a United States citizen. My father-in-law also went to Korea. I met my wife at Fort Lewis when we were in high school, and after I enlisted, after my basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington, we got married in March of 1970. So here I was going down to Fort Sam Houston to be trained as a medic in the middle of my first couple of months of marriage. I got my orders for Vietnam while we were down there. I went to Vietnam in July of 1970, and my wife went back up to stay with her family in Washington State. I was about to be introduced to the reality of war. When I got to Vietnam, I came in at Tan Son Nhut Air Base and got sent up north to the I Corps, which was up near the DMZ, and joined an outfit called the 23rd Infantry Division as a combat medic. Little did I know that the 23rd Infantry Division, 2 years before that, had been involved in the massacre at My Lai. None of this was coming out at the time that I enlisted in the Army, but by the time I got there, they were already calling the division the Baby Killers because of what happened at My Lai. After 6 months, I was able to go to Hawaii to meet my wife. Married couples were allowed to meet each other in Hawaii, while single soldiers could go to Bangkok, Hong Kong, Australia, but nobody was allowed to go back to the world, that being the United States of America. All of us had to the married couples could meet in Hawaii, but no one could get back to the United States because there was a concern that if a lot of GIs returned home, they might not return to their units overseas. After a week of R&R, which is what it's called, rest and recreation, I returned to Vietnam and I finished my tour. I came home in August of 1971. I like to quote another Vietnam veteran. I like to say, I went to Vietnam as an American fighting man, and when I came home, I was a human being. That's why I've been struggling to come to some kind of understanding of what happened to me and to reach some kind of feeling about what that is, what was going through my head at the time. I joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and I marched in my first Veterans Day parade in 1972 in Seattle, Washington. And we had garbage thrown at us. We got called traitors because we were Vietnam Veterans Against the War and we were marching with the peace protesters. It often surprised me to think about how they would talk about veterans being spit on, and here we were being disparaged by our very people who supposedly supported the war. After that time, I moved down to San Francisco with my wife, We lived there for a few years. Then we came out here to Hartford, Connecticut in 1976, and I have been in Hartford, Connecticut ever since. I have 4 daughters. I'm still married to my wife. It's been 47 years, and we spent a lot of our time working in Hartford in the school systems. Also, one of the things that I did, I was invited into Hartford High by the teachers of my daughters to speak in the classrooms about my experience in Vietnam. So some of that is what I've been doing all these years. This is a continuation of that same thing, the continuation, the voice of veterans. I also have been working for the Hartford Public Library for 28 years, and I just recently retired. So I'm going to be using the resources that the Hartford Public Library has given me and has gotten. Many books written by veterans will probably be used on this show, and we will also read excerpts from them and talk about what those are the voices of veterans also. Steve Fournier, my comrade who's been here for many years in Hartford, is an Air Force veteran who was in the language and intelligence in Germany. He will offer some of his insights when he has a chance to. And we intend to bring all of this out to you to look at and to listen to. That's the purpose of this show, and that's what we're hoping to do. All right. What I want to bring to your attention is some other facts that I have with me now. This is the Agent Orange newsletter that veterans get. It talks about research to improve VA policies and health care. All of these things are available at veteran centers across the state. And I hope to eventually have some of the counselors and people who are involved in helping veterans come on the show and talk about the things that they're doing and what there is out there for veterans to participate in. What I'd like to do today, because it's the anniversary of American involvement 100 years in the First World War, I would like to read the words of a veteran who fought in the First World War and tell you a little bit about that person. Siegfried Sassoon fought with the British Army in the First World War. He was an officer, and he also was involved in the Battle of the Somme, which is one of the bloodiest occurrences that happened in the First World War. In fact, during the first hour of the Battle of the Somme, over 60,000 British soldiers were killed and wounded because at that point, the technology of the war had improved to the point where men were running directly into machine gun fire and artillery fire across what's known as no man's land. After 3 or 4 years of fighting in the trenches, he lost his best friend, and he acquired the nickname Mad Jack because at one point he was crawling across no man's land with a knife into the trenches of the Germans and cutting their throats, and then he would crawl back. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest award that can be given to a veteran. It's similar to the Congressional Medal of Honor. Siegfried Sassoon was suffering from severe psychological and spiritual trauma from his activities in the war. And as he continued to break down, he decided that when he came back to England for leave, he decided that he was going to quit the war. So he wrote a letter to Parliament. The letter was called Finished with the War. And I'm just going to read this letter to you so you can get an idea of what Siegfried Sassoon was going through. He says, I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been clearly stated as to have made it impossible for them to be changed without our knowledge. And that had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolonging those sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the military conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of these who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced on them. I also believe that it may help to destroy the callous complacence with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. You have to understand that this was a statement made by a man who won the Victoria Cross. Many of his officers, including Robert Graves and Wilfred Owen, were very distraught over what he was doing, and Robert Graves tried to stop him from sending this letter to Parliament, but he went ahead and he did it anyway. They were brought up to a place called Craig Lockhart, which was a hospital that was run by Dr. Rivers, and at that point they were talked to and they were given the first instances of psychological damage that was causing them to speak out against the war. This was the beginning of what you might call PTSD and moral injury. Dr. Rivers was one of the first people to talk about the damage that was being done to the soldiers and what they were exposed to and how they were going to deal with it. I would say that today Dr. Rivers would be much welcomed if he was here. And one of the men who has taken over for him is another doctor who worked up in VA, and he wrote a number of books called Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. Dr. Jonathan Shea, who worked for the VA. He also has talked about PTSD, and he talks about a moral injury, which can also cause severe psychological trauma and also changes to the brain if it's not taken care of. So these are some of the main issues that we're going to be talking about on this program, and we're also going to be talking about how dangerous PTSD can be to injure veterans. Another very interesting book that I'm going to be talking about is called Flashback, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, Suicide and the Lessons of War, written by Penny Coleman, who was the wife of a Vietnam veteran who committed suicide. This particular book, Flashback, talks about the damage done to the families of veterans and their own children. And I've often wondered to myself, what did I do to my children? Because I have 4 daughters. And I'm also beginning to realize that they could be called Vietnam veterans because they've had to live with us this entire time that we've been dealing with the war. Because when I often would go into the schools, I would put up a quote on the board that said, Vietnam is over and over and over and over. And you get the picture, all right? The war does not go away. And I think this is one of the most important things that we need to talk about with the American public. The American public has got to come to some kind of understanding, not only what we're doing, the damage that we're doing all over the world, but the damage that we're doing to ourselves, and that we need to take a hard look at that and find out what we can do to stop. One of the things today that most of us are dealing with is how this is coming out into the streets of America. And I think that in Hartford we will end up eventually talking about how the war has come home. There's a great book by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman who touches on this. It's called On Killing. And one of the things that Colonel Grossman talks about is the existence of a powerful and innate human resistance toward killing one's own species and the psychological mechanisms that have been developed by armies over the centuries to overcome that resistance. The role of atrocity and war and the mechanisms by which armies are both empowered and entrapped by atrocity. What it feels like to kill, a set of standard responses to killing in combat and the psychological price of killing, the techniques that have been developed and applied with tremendous success in modern combat training in order to condition soldiers to overcome their resistance to killing. How the American soldier in Vietnam was first psychologically enabled to kill to a far greater degree than any other soldier in history, then denied the psychologically essential purification ritual that exists in every warrior society, and finally condemned and accused by his own society to a degree that is unprecedented in Western history. The terrible, tragic price that America's 3 million Vietnam veterans, their families, and our society are paying for what we did to our soldiers in Vietnam. Finally, and perhaps most important, I believe that this study will provide insight into the way that rifts in our society combine with violence in the media and in interactive video games to indiscriminately condition our nation's children to kill in a fashion very similar to the way the Army conditions our soldiers. But without the safeguards, and we will see the terrible, tragic price that our nation is paying for what we are doing to our children. This is just a taste of some of the issues that we're going to be bringing up. And I think a lot of this talk about drones is also going to be something that we're going to be talking about, because it's the vicarious killing and the bravery of being out of range that has damaged us beyond belief. I think one of the few things that we can do to work on these problems is to be aware of what's happening and how we can appreciate that. I was fortunate to meet a man, Claude Angen, who was a Vietnam veteran, who also became a Buddhist monk. Claude Angen was a door gunner in a Cobra gunship in Vietnam. He was there at the age of 19, very similar to myself. I was 19. And he was a participant in a lot of combat activity and action. He was awarded 21 air medals, and you receive 1 air medal for every 5 combat operations. So that means he was on over close to 150 combat operations. When he came home, he decided to study Buddhism, and he was terrified that An Lak would not take him as a student, as a Buddhist priest. But he went to him and he talked to him about it, because this person was a Vietnamese Buddhist priest, and he took on Claude Angen to train him in Buddhism. And Claude Angen came to Trinity School to talk to his students and to us. This is his book. It's called At Hell's Gate, and it's probably one of the books that I'll be using at a later date to talk to you about. But these are all the voices of veterans and their families that I think are the most important part of what we're doing today with this program. My hope is that as we get deeper and deeper into this, I'll be bringing more voices of veterans on. We'll also be bringing, guests on who are veterans, and we can talk about a lot of these issues that are so endemic in our society today. I think that that part of what we're doing with this program is to open up the hearts and the minds of Americans to the damage that is being done all over the world. My hope also is that you will learn from this program how painful it is for veterans to come back to a nation and be haunted by their service and not get the proper care and understanding that they need. One of the things that wasn't done was demobilization as a group. When we went to Vietnam, we went over as individuals. We very often flew over on a plane with over 150 people who did not know each other. And when we got there, we were separated out into our units. And when we finally came home, we came home alone also, and as individuals. So I think that this is going to be part of the trauma that we have to deal with. And hopefully, my hope is that we will come to some conclusions about how to help ourselves and our nation heal from the wounds of war. And I hope that this program is going to be of interest to you, and I hope that you enjoy what you see, and I hope that you will participate in the future on what we have to offer you. I'm also going to be presenting a fair amount of pictures and articles from the paper and from things that have been done. And I will also bring to your attention programs that are being offered at the Hartford Public Library, which this month is doing a program on World War I in America. And on May 11th at the Hartford History Center, the author David Drury will be there to talk about his book about World War I. And in June, on June 1st, there is another program called Why Preserve, Digitizing Stories in Connecticut and Latinos in the Military. And on June 10th and 11th a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Hartford History Center, there will be another program on digitization of the library. Thank you very much.